Welcome to The Shadow in Room 9, a classic Hercule Poirot mystery where secrets kill and truth demands justice. When Sir Reginald promised to expose a killer, he became one himself. Now Room 9 guards deadly secrets. Impossible evidence frames the innocent, and only Hercule Poirot can solve this locked room murder before the real killer strikes again. Trust no one. Step into the Mayfair Grand, where every whisper hides a lie. Every alibi conceals guilt, and the truth waits behind a door that should never have opened. Can you solve the mystery before Poirot reveals all? The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of the Mayfair Grand Hotel, with the persistence of an unwelcome memory, each droplet seeming to whisper secrets that the elegant establishment had long sought to bury. In the hotel's opulent peacock lounge, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across Persian carpets and mahogany paneling, the monthly gathering of the Britannia Investment Circle was reaching its crescendo of civilized tension. Sir Reginald Blackthorne, the steel magnate whose fortune had built half of Manchester's industrial district, stood before the ornate fireplace like a general surveying his troops. At 72, he remained formidable, his silver beard meticulously groomed, his dark eyes sharp as the Sheffield steel that had made his name. Tonight, however, there was something different in his, bearing a tightness around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and carefully guarded secrets. "Gentlemen," Sir Reginald announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "tonight marks not merely another meeting of our circle, but a reckoning of sorts." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the assembled company with deliberate precision. "I have made certain discoveries regarding investments made by members of this very circle, discoveries that will surprise you all." The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken fears. Dr. Edmund Carstairs, the distinguished physician whose Harley Street practice catered to London's elite, shifted uncomfortably in his leather armchair, his usually steady hands betraying the slightest tremor as he reached for his brandy. His reputation for discretion was legendary, but tonight his composure seemed as fragile as autumn leaves. Near the tall windows, Mrs. Vivian Ashford stood with the poise of a woman who had learned to navigate society's treacherous waters through 2 decades of widowhood. Her emerald silk gown complemented her still striking features, but her green eyes held a wariness that suggested she had heard such pronouncements before and knew their cost. The diamond necklace at her throat caught the lamplight, each stone seeming to pulse with its own inner fire. Young Mr. Oliver Pemberton, Sir Reginald's private secretary and the son of his late business partner, sat rigidly upright, his notebook balanced on his knee with mathematical precision. At 28, he possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that made older men both proud and nervous. His pen remained poised above the paper, but his knuckles were white with tension. "Kuch to gadbad hai," he thought, using the Hindi phrase his ayah had taught him in childhood, when something felt terribly wrong. Captain James Thornfield, recently returned from service in India, lounged with studied casualness near the bar, his military bearing evident despite his civilian attire. The slight limp that marked his left leg was a souvenir of the northwest frontier, but it was the haunted look in his blue eyes that truly spoke of his experiences. His relationship with Sir Reginald was complex creditor and debtor, mentor and protégé, bound together by obligations that neither fully understood. Miss Helena Fairweather, the hotel's assistant manager and the only woman permitted to attend these gatherings due to her discretion and efficiency, stood quietly by the service door, her gray dress impeccable, her dark hair pulled back in a severe chignon. She had managed the Mayfair Grand's most sensitive arrangements for 15 years, and her silence was as valuable as her service. Tonight, however, her usual composure seemed strained, and she glanced repeatedly toward the corridor that led to the private suites. "The matter," Sir Reginald continued, "concerns certain irregularities in the accounts of the Bengal Mining Consortium, irregularities that have cost investors nearly £50,000. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "I know who is responsible." "Doctor," Carstairs set down his brandy with a sharp click. "Reginald, surely such matters should be discussed privately." Sir Reginald interrupted. "Has been the enemy of justice in this affair." "No, Edmund. Tonight, we shall have truth, regardless of the cost to reputations or friendships. Mrs. Ashford moved closer to the fireplace, her silk gown rustling like autumn leaves. And what form will this truth take, Reginald? Evidence, he replied simply. Documents, correspondence, proof that will satisfy even the most skeptical magistrate. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio, its brass clasps gleaming in the firelight. Everything is here. Names, dates, amounts. The complete record of a most elaborate deception. Oliver Pemberton's pen clattered to the floor. As he bent to retrieve it, his voice came out strangled. Sir Reginald, perhaps we should... Should what, Oliver? Protect the guilty? Enable further theft? Sir Reginald's eyes fixed on his secretary with an intensity that made the young man flinch. I think not. Captain Thornfield straightened, his casual demeanor evaporating. You're playing a dangerous game, Blackthorn. Some secrets are better left buried. Secrets, James? Or crimes? Sir Reginald smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I shall retire to my suite, shortly to review these documents one final time. Room 9, as always. In the morning, I shall present my findings to Scotland Yard. Miss Fairweather cleared her throat delicately. Sir, if I may. Room 9 has been, that is, the staff have reported certain irregularities. Irregularities? Mrs. Ashford asked sharply. Strange sounds in the night, footsteps in the corridor when the room should be empty, the previous occupant. Miss Fairweather paused, her professional composure wavering. The previous occupant of room 9 met with an unfortunate accident. You'll recall. Mr. Harrington, the banker. They found him at the bottom of the service stairs, quite dead. The coroner ruled it accidental, but the staff, well, they have their superstitions. Sir Reginald waved dismissively. Nonsense. I've occupied room 9 for 3 years without incident. It's the finest suite in the hotel, and I'll not be driven from it by servants' gossip. Dr. Carstairs leaned forward, his medical training asserting itself. Nevertheless, Reginald, perhaps tonight you might consider... I shall consider nothing of the sort. Sir Reginald's voice brooked no argument. Room 9 has served me well, and it shall do so again tonight. By morning, justice will be done. He tucked the leather portfolio inside his jacket and moved toward the door. I bid you all good evening. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow will bring clarity. As Sir Reginald departed, the remaining members of the circle sat in uncomfortable silence. The fire crackled softly, casting shifting shadows across their faces, each lost in private thoughts and calculations. Outside, the rain continued its relentless drumming, and somewhere in the hotel's depths, a clock chimed the half-hour. It was Miss Fairweather who broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Room 9 has been prepared as requested. Fresh linens, a fire laid, and the documents safe secured as per Sir Reginald's instructions. She paused, then added with visible reluctance, I've stationed a night porter on the corridor, as is customary for our most distinguished guests. Mrs. Ashford gathered her evening wrap, her movements sharp with suppressed agitation. Then I suppose we must trust that morning will indeed bring clarity, as Sir Reginald promises. But as the members of the Britannia investment circle began to disperse, each carrying their secrets like heavy stones, none could have predicted that morning would bring not clarity, but a mystery so profound that it would require the intervention of a certain Belgian detective with an egg-shaped head and an unshakable faith in the power of psychology over circumstance. The shadows in the Peacock Lounge seemed to deepen as the last guest departed. And somewhere above, in the corridor leading to room 9, a floorboard creaked under the weight of an unseen presence, a presence that had been waiting, with infinite patience, for exactly this moment. What terrible secret did Sir Reginald's portfolio contain, and why did the very mention of room 9 seem to cast such a pall over the evening's gathering? As the night deepened and the hotel settled into uneasy silence, forces long dormant began to stir, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would leave one person dead and the survivors forever changed. The heavy oak door of the Peacock Lounge closed behind Sir Reginald with a finality that seemed to drain the very air from the room. In the silence that followed, The remaining members of the Britannia investment circle sat frozen like figures in a tableau, each lost in private calculations of risk and consequence. The fire crackled softly, casting restless shadows across faces that had suddenly aged years in mere moments. Dr. Carstairs was the first to move, rising from his leather armchair with the careful deliberation of a man whose world had just shifted beneath his feet. His medical training had taught him to recognize the symptoms of impending crisis, and every instinct now screamed danger. "Perhaps," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "we should consider the wisdom of Sir Reginald's revelations." Mrs. Ashford's fingers worked nervously at her diamond necklace, each stone catching the firelight like captured tears. Wisdom, Edmund, or folly? Her voice carried the bitter edge of experience. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Captain Thornfield moved to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. The military bearing that had carried him through countless battles seemed suddenly fragile. "The question," he said without turning, "is whether Sir Reginald truly understands the nature of the forces he's choosing to unleash." Young Oliver Pemberton gathered his scattered papers with shaking hands, his usual efficiency replaced by barely controlled panic. "I should. That is, Sir Reginald will expect his correspondence to be ready for tomorrow's presentation. Perhaps I should retire and—" "Oliver." Mrs. Ashford's voice cut through his stammering like a blade. "Some nights are not meant for sleep." Miss Fairweather, ever the professional, supervised the clearing of glasses with mechanical precision, but her movements betrayed an underlying tension. She had witnessed many secrets within these walls, had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of high society's hidden shames. Tonight, however, felt different. Tonight carried the weight of finality. As the gathering dispersed, each member carrying their fears like lead weights, Miss Fairweather made her way to the second floor. She found Hopkins, the night porter, already stationed in the corridor outside room 9, his chair positioned with military precision opposite the heavy oak door. At 62, Hopkins had served the Mayfair Grand for 3 decades, and his loyalty was as unshakable as his discretion. "No disturbances," she instructed, though she knew Hopkins understood the gravity of his vigil. "Sir Reginald has specifically requested complete privacy until morning." Hopkins nodded, settling into his chair with the patience of a professional guardian. His ledger lay open on the small table beside him, ready to record the minutiae of the night's watch. The corridor fell into the hushed expectancy that belonged to the small hours, broken only by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the lobby below. At 11:30, Hopkins noted the soft sound of Sir Reginald's voice from within room 9, not conversation, but the measured cadence of a man reading aloud, perhaps reviewing his damning evidence one final time. At midnight, the hotel's ancient heating system settled with its customary groans and whispers. It was at 17 minutes past midnight when Hopkins heard the first unusual sound, a sharp crack, like wood splintering, followed by what might have been a muffled cry. He leaned forward, straining to hear, but the thick walls of room 9 revealed nothing more. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical weight. At 12:30, Hopkins realized that the usual sounds from room 9, the rustle of papers, the creak of floorboards, the soft movements of occupancy had ceased entirely. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of held breath, of secrets crystallizing into terrible truth. Hopkins consulted his pocket watch with growing unease as the minute hand crept past 12:40. The oppressive silence from room 9 had stretched beyond the bounds of normal sleep, carrying with it the weight of terrible possibility. His 30 years of service had taught him to recognize the subtle rhythms of the hotel's nocturnal life, and this profound stillness felt wrong, dangerously wrong. At 12:39, soft footsteps echoed from the corridor's far end. Oliver Pemberton appeared, clutching an unsealed envelope, his face pale as parchment in the dim gaslight. "I, Sir Reginald, requested additional correspondence," he stammered, his usual composure shattered. Hopkins stepped deliberately between the young secretary and the door. "His bell hasn't rung, Mr. Pemberton." I'll see he receives it in the morning. Oliver hesitated, his eyes darting to the base of the door as if hoping for some sign of life within. He placed the envelope on Hopkins's table with trembling fingers and retreated with an apology that sounded more like a prayer. 12:47 brought heavier footsteps, Captain Thornfield emerging from the shadows near the service stairs, the faint clink of glass betraying a hip flask in his pocket. "Needed air," he muttered, avoiding Hopkins's questioning gaze. His military bearing seemed diminished, his limp more pronounced as he passed toward the smoking terrace. At precisely 1 o'clock, the grandfather clock below tolled with funeral solemnity. As the echoes died, Hopkins heard something that made his blood freeze, a soft, metallic sound from within room 9. Like a chain being carefully secured. He knew that sound intimately. It was the safety chain being engaged from inside. But who had engaged it? And why now, after such prolonged silence? Hopkins knocked firmly. "Sir Reginald." "Hopkins on duty, sir." The silence that answered carried a quality he recognized from his brief military service, the particular stillness that belonged to places where life had recently departed. A faint, acrid scent crept beneath the door, sharp and wrong, not the warm smoke of coal, but the bitter tang of burned paper. Miss Fairweather appeared at his urgent summons, her professional composure intact despite the hour. "You're certain something's amiss?" There was a cry before midnight, then nothing. Now that smell. And someone's set the chain. Hopkins met her eyes with grave understanding. "I've seen death before, Miss Fairweather. This feels final." She listened, at the door, her face growing pale. "Fetch Mr. Davies from security." Quietly. The head of security arrived within minutes, his usual calm cracked by the tension in the corridor. Miss Fairweather tried the master key. The door opened a fraction before catching hard against the chain. "Sir Reginald," she called with professional authority edged by desperation, "this is Miss Fairweather. Please respond if you require assistance." Only the rain answered, drumming against the windows like fingers of the dead. Davies produced the chain-cutting tool from the emergency kit, his movements deliberate despite his obvious reluctance. The chain snapped with a sound like breaking bones, and the door swung open to reveal room 9 bathed in the dying firelight. Sir Reginald sat in his leather chair, appearing to sleep peacefully, but the unnatural stillness of his form and the blue tinge to his lips told a different story. Before him, the mahogany table bore scattered papers and an overturned inkwell. But the leather portfolio, the damning evidence he'd promised to reveal, had vanished completely. Miss Fairweather stepped into room 9 with the practiced composure of one who had witnessed society's darkest secrets. But the scene before her tested even her considerable reserves of professional detachment. Sir Reginald sat in his leather chair as if engaged in quiet contemplation. Yet the unnatural stillness of his form and the distinctive blue tinge around his lips proclaimed a far more sinister truth. "Don't disturb anything," she instructed Davies, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Fetch Doctor Carstairs immediately. He's in the Wellington suite." The room whispered its secrets through carefully arranged details. The mahogany table bore scattered papers, their edges singed as though hastily rescued from flames, while an overturned inkwell had bled dark stains across the pristine white cloth. Most tellingly, the leather portfolio that had contained Sir Reginald's damning evidence had vanished completely, leaving only a faint rectangular outline in the dust where it had rested. Dr. Carstairs arrived within minutes, his medical bag clutched against the night's horrors. His examination was swift but thorough, practiced fingers checking pulse points that would never respond again. "He's been dead at least an hour," he pronounced, leaning closer to the still face. "There's a distinctive odor, bitter almonds. Hydrocyanic acid, most likely. Death would have been rapid." Davies examined the door mechanism with methodical precision. Chain was secured from inside, no forced entry. Windows latched from within, 40-foot drop below. Whoever did this had intimate knowledge of the hotel's layout. Miss Fairweather surveyed the scene with growing certainty. This was no suicide. Sir Reginald had been silenced before his morning revelation could destroy reputations and lives. "Seal this corridor," she ordered. "And, Hopkins, there's a Belgian gentleman in suite 3. A detective of considerable reputation. Perhaps it's time we sought specialized assistance. Hopkins descended to Suite 3, with the weight of terrible knowledge pressing upon his shoulders. The corridor's gaslight flickered against the early morning shadows as he approached the door behind which resided a guest whose reputation had preceded him throughout London's most exclusive circles. The hotel's registry bore an elegant signature in violet ink: M. Hercule Poirot, Detective. The knock was answered with surprising promptness by a diminutive figure whose egg-shaped head and magnificent mustache were already legendary among Scotland Yard's finest. Despite the ungodly hour, Poirot appeared immaculately groomed, his green eyes sharp with an intelligence that seemed to penetrate the very fabric of human deception. Monsieur Hopkins, Poirot's accent carried the precise musicality of educated Belgium, the night porter whose vigilance has become the stuff of legend among the staff. You arrive bearing grave tidings. I perceive your complexion speaks of death, and not the natural variety. Hopkins found himself momentarily speechless before this small man whose presence seemed to fill the doorway with quiet authority. Sir, that is Sir Reginald Blackthorne in room 9. He's dead, sir. Doctor. Carstairs says poison, and the room was secured from within. Poirot's eyes narrowed with professional fascination. Ah, c'est très intéressant. A locked room, a powerful man, and the hour when secrets whisper their darkest truths. He reached for his jacket with practiced efficiency. Lead the way, mon ami. Hercule Poirot places himself at your service. As they ascended toward room 9, Poirot absorbed every detail with methodical precision: the quality of the carpet that would muffle footsteps, the spacing of gas fixtures that created pools of shadow, the subtle acoustics that might carry whispers or conceal the sounds of murder. His mind catalogued possibilities with the efficiency of a master craftsman, each observation forming part of a larger pattern. Upon reaching the sealed corridor, Poirot paused at the threshold of room 9, his gaze sweeping the scene with the intensity of a master painter studying his canvas. We disturb nothing unnecessary, n'est-ce pas? Order is the friend of truth, and chaos the enemy of justice. He stood just inside the doorway, nostrils flaring delicately at the distinctive bitter almond scent that lingered in the air. The hydrocyanic acid. It speaks of swift death, but the burned papers whisper of desperate concealment. His eyes fixed upon the scattered documents, their singed edges telling their own story of hasty destruction. The timeline, mon ami Hopkins, Poirot requested, settling into his methodical approach. Every detail, if you please. Hopkins recounted the evening's progression, Sir Reginald's voice reading aloud at 11:30, the sharp crack and muffled cry at 17 minutes past midnight, then the profound silence. Young Pemberton's nervous appearance at 12:39 with an envelope, Captain Thornfield's passage at 12:47, and finally the metallic sound of the safety chain being secured at 1 o'clock. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then approached the mahogany table where the missing portfolio had left its telltale outline in the dust. Someone wished for ashes, he murmured, touching a tiny fragment of charred paper that had escaped destruction, yet left evidence that refuses to die. His attention turned to Sir Reginald's still form, noting the unnatural positioning of the right hand and a faint staining on the palm. As his gaze swept the carpet near the skirting board, a dull gleam caught his eye. With infinite care, he lifted a small object using his handkerchief. It was a cufflink, oval, and scratched by long wear, engraved with intertwined letters that gleamed in the dying firelight. J.T. Poirot's mustache twitched with satisfaction. So, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of dawning understanding. The room speaks, but its testimony contradicts the obvious truth. Poirot carefully wrapped the cufflink in his handkerchief, holding it up to catch the gaslight's amber glow. The engraved initials J.T. seemed to pulse with accusatory significance, yet his expression remained thoughtfully neutral. Captain James Thornfield, he murmured, his accent lending gravity to each syllable. A military man whose personal effects speak from within a chamber of death, yet who passed through this corridor at 12:47, 30 minutes after our victim's final cry. Miss Fairweather shifted uncomfortably. Monsieur Poirot, surely Captain Thornfield's reputation. Ah, mademoiselle, Poirot interrupted gently. Reputation is like a fine coat. It may conceal much beneath its elegant exterior, but we must ask ourselves, is this cufflink the voice of truth or the whisper of deliberate deception? He moved to the safety chain with clinical precision, his fingertip hovering over the brass mechanism without touching. Observe, mes amis, fresh grease along the slider, and here, these parallel scratches on the plate. This chain was not secured by a dying man's trembling hand, but manipulated from without, using some clever device. At 1 o'clock, Hopkins heard the metallic sound, yet Sir Reginald had been dead for nearly 40 minutes. Say impossible unless we accept that someone remained in this room after death had claimed its victim. Dr. Carstairs leaned forward, his medical training asserting itself. But, Monsieur Poirot, the windows are latched from within. The door was chained. Précisément. Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. We have not a miracle, but a trick. Someone wished us to believe in the impossible, while they accomplished the merely difficult. He knelt beside the fireplace, using his silver pen to extract a fragment of charred paper from the grate. The corner bore part of a blue letterhead, Gal Mining Consortium, and beneath it, figures suggesting financial calculations of staggering magnitude. The killer burned Sir Reginald's evidence with great haste. Yet fear, she makes one careless. N'est-ce pas? They left us breadcrumbs to follow. Moving to examine the carpet near the skirting board, Poirot's nostrils flared delicately. The bitter almond scent was strongest here, not near the table where Sir Reginald sat. A faint stain, almost invisible against the dark pattern, traced a small spatter toward the fender. The poison was administered here. Then the victim moved to his chair, arranged like a tableau of peaceful death. Hopkins watched with growing fascination as the small Belgian detective reconstructed the crime. But, sir, the timing if Captain Thornfield passed at 12:47, and the chain wasn't secured until 1 o'clock. Exactly. Poirot straightened, his mustache twitching with satisfaction. Our killer waited, and watched. But why such patience? What required 13 minutes of careful arrangement after death had already accomplished its work. He approached Sir Reginald's still form, noting the unnatural positioning of the right hand and a faint ink stain on the palm, though the inkwell had been overturned during the struggle. Near the heavy curtains, barely visible against the dark fabric, a single thread of military blue wool clung to the fabric, the precise shade worn by officers of Her Majesty's Indian Service. The evidence, it points like arrows toward Captain Thornfield, Poirot mused. Yet something troubles the little gray cells. In my experience, when the path appears too clear, too obvious, it is because someone has taken great pains to make it so. Miss Fairweather produced the sealed envelope containing the duplicate keys to the room safe. Intact, as you requested, Monsieur Poirot. Bon. Then Sir Reginald kept his portfolio on the table to work from, and someone came prepared not merely to silence him, but to ensure his secrets died with him. Poirot's gaze swept the assembled faces with penetrating intensity. But here is the question that haunts Hercule Poirot. If this was a crime of desperate necessity, why leave such obvious evidence? A cufflink, a thread, a convenient timeline, unless... He paused, allowing the weight of implication to settle over the room like morning fog. Unless our killer wishes us to arrest Captain Thornfield, while the true murderer walks free, hidden behind a masterpiece of misdirection. Poirot requested Hopkins's corridor ledger, with the reverence of a scholar approaching ancient manuscripts. His fingertips traced each entry with meticulous precision, noting not merely the words, but the subtle variations in ink flow and pressure that revealed the writer's emotional state. Observe, mes amis, he murmured, indicating the entry at 12:39. The ink here has feathered into the page, written with a steady hand. But at 1 o'clock, he pointed to the final notation. The ink sits upon the surface like fresh blood. Hopkins wrote this immediately after hearing the chain engage, his hand trembling with sudden understanding. The envelope from young Pemberton lay before them, innocent yet somehow sinister in its simplicity. Poirot weighed it carefully, then withdrew its contents, a single sheet bearing a message in trembling script. The Bengal mining accounts require immediate attention. Critical discrepancies in Thornfield investments discovered. O.P. Très curieux, Poirot observed, holding the paper to the gaslight. This message, it bears the watermark of hotel stationery. Yet, see here, he indicated faint impressions along the edges. This envelope was opened, emptied, and refilled. Someone wished to replace damaging evidence with evidence that damns. Another. Miss Fairweather summoned Captain Thornfield, who arrived with military bearing that barely concealed inner turmoil. Poirot's gaze immediately fixed upon the man's bare left wrist. Your cufflink. Captain, a family heirloom? Perhaps? Thornfield's jaw tightened. Lost it somewhere. These things happen. Indeed they do, Poirot agreed pleasantly, particularly when they are needed to establish guilt elsewhere. Tell me, Captain, what brought you to the corridor at 12:47, the precise time when a murderer required witnesses to establish their carefully constructed timeline? The military man's composure cracked slightly. I needed air, couldn't sleep, knowing what Reginald planned to reveal about the Bengal investments. Ah, Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. So you knew of Sir Reginald's intentions. But here is what puzzles Hercule Poirot if you were guilty of financial irregularities. Why leave your cufflink as evidence? Unless, he paused, dramatically, unless someone else required your guilt to conceal their own far greater crime. Poirot studied Captain Thornfield's military bearing with the penetrating gaze of a master psychologist. You speak of needing air, yet your fear is not of exposure but of entrapment. The guilty man confesses when cornered, the innocent man protests his virtue. You, mon capitaine, do neither. You accept guilt that is not yours, which suggests someone has convinced you that resistance is futile. He turned his attention to Sir Reginald's still form, lifting the victim's right hand with infinite care. Observe, mes amis, this ink stain upon the palm, and here, this slight scorch mark upon the thumb, not from the overturned inkwell, but from something far more sinister. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction. A fountain pen, filled not with ink but with hydrocyanic acid. The killer approached with a document requiring signature, perhaps a final addendum to the evening's revelations. Sir Reginald, trusting and unsuspecting, grasped the pen and received his death sentence through the very instrument of his profession. Miss Fairweather produced an envelope from her pocket with reluctant precision. This arrived with Sir Reginald's breakfast this morning. 5 words only. Room 9 remembers everything now. He went quite pale upon reading it. Poirot examined the paper with reverence. Local postmark. Hotel stationery. Sealed with your desk gum, rather than posted properly. Someone within these walls knew of Sir Reginald's investigation and sought to unnerve him before tonight's confrontation. Dr. Carstairs leaned forward, his medical training asserting itself. But the investments? Poirot, surely, the financial motive. Précisément, docteur. Tell me, what sum did each of you invest in the Bengal Mining Consortium? Captain Thornfield speaks of £3,000. Yet, Sir Reginald mentioned 50,000 in losses. Someone else participated in this. Venture someone whose stake was so substantial that exposure meant complete ruin. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor. Young Oliver Pemberton appeared, his face ashen with terror, clutching a torn envelope. "The safe!" he gasped. "Someone's been at the hotel safe. The duplicate records, they're gone." Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as Oliver's breathless revelation confirmed his growing suspicions. "The safe. Mon ami, you speak of methodical destruction, not desperate improvisation. Lead us there immediately." The manager's office revealed its secrets with reluctant precision. The hotel safe stood open, its brass mechanism unmarked by force, while torn fragments of brown envelope clung to the inner compartment like accusatory whispers. Poirot examined the lock with his magnifying glass, noting microscopic scratches that spoke of practiced familiarity. The combination was changed monthly, Miss Fairweather confirmed, her professional composure strained. Only Mr. Davies and myself possessed current access. Précisément, Poirot murmured, lifting a fragment of paper with his silver pen. The bitter almond scent clung to the documents, the same poison that had claimed Sir Reginald's life. Our killer worked here after the murder, wearing gloves still contaminated with hydrocyanic acid. See here, he indicated faint impressions on the blotter. The pressure marks suggest someone copying numbers, perhaps memorizing account details before destruction. Mrs. Ashford stepped forward, her emerald gown rustling with nervous energy. Monsieur Poirot, you must understand the Bengal Mining Consortium represented more than mere investment for some of us. My late husband left debts that threatened our family's very survival. £47,000 I invested my children's entire inheritance. Ah, Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Now the stakes become clear. Not merely financial ruin, but social. Destruction, criminal charges, the dissolution of everything you have fought to preserve. He examined the safe's interior once more, then paused, his head tilted like a bird sensing danger. From the corridor came the sound of running footsteps, followed by Hopkins's strangled cry. Monsieur Poirot, come quickly, there's been another death. They rushed to the service stairwell where Davies lay crumpled at the bottom, his head twisted at an unnatural angle, one hand still gripping the iron railing as though death had surprised him mid-descent. The narrow shaft reeked of floor polish and something more sinister, the lingering trace of bitter almonds that had become the signature of this deadly night. Doctor, Carstairs knelt beside the security chief, his practiced fingers confirming what the impossible angle of the neck had already proclaimed. Instantaneous, he murmured, his voice hollow with growing dread. The cervical vertebrae snapped cleanly. He would not have suffered. Poirot descended the stairs with meticulous care, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail. Observe. Mes amis, the hat remains uncrushed despite the fall, the pocket watch unbroken, though its crystal is delicate as an eggshell. This was no accidental tumble. His silver pen indicated 2 parallel scratches on the polished wood of the top step. Fresh wax applied here, creating a treacherous surface. Our friend Davies was sent to his death with calculated precision. With infinite delicacy, Poirot pried open the dead man's right hand, revealing a slender steel device, curved like a surgical instrument. The mechanism for manipulating the safety chain from outside room 9, he announced with quiet satisfaction, dropped in the killer's haste to silence the one person who could expose their method. Miss Fairweather gasped, her professional composure finally cracking. Then Davies knew, précisément. He discovered how the locked room was achieved, and for that knowledge, he paid with his life. Poirot's gaze swept the assembled faces with penetrating intensity. But see here, he indicated faint impressions in the dust of the upper landing. 2 sets of footprints, Davies's heavy military boots, and beside them, the narrow heel of a lady's shoe, one that turned slightly outward, the gait of someone who has spent years navigating these corridors with practiced stealth. The implications hung in the air like a death sentence, and somewhere in the hotel's depths, a telephone began to ring with urgent, accusatory persistence. The telephone's persistent ringing echoed through the hotel's corridors with the urgency of a death knell, each shrill note seeming to mock the growing desperation that hung over the Mayfair Grand like London fog. Poirot approached the switchboard alcove where the night operator sat pale and trembling. Her hand hovering uncertainly over the blinking lamp marked extension 9. It rings itself, monsieur, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mechanical clamor. No voice on the line, only breathing, as though someone listens from the other side of silence. Poirot lifted the receiver with ceremonial precision, his green eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. The line hummed with electric tension. Then came the faint sound of controlled breathing, measured and deliberate. "Allo," he said softly, his accent lending gravity to the simple greeting. "You have pushed one man down these same stairs before, n'est-ce pas? A second murder brings not freedom, but the closing of the trap you have so carefully constructed around yourself." The breathing ceased abruptly. The line clicked dead with the finality of a coffin lid. Poirot replaced the receiver with fastidious care, his mustache twitching with quiet triumph. "A test, mes amis, our killer wishes to know whether panic has scattered our attention, whether the discovery of Davies has drawn us away from the true center of this web." His gaze swept the assembled company with penetrating intensity, lingering almost imperceptibly on Miss Fairweather's narrow-heeled shoes. noting how the left turned slightly outward, the distinctive gait of someone who had navigated these corridors with practiced stealth for 15 years. His expression remained carefully neutral, but the little gray cells were arranging the final pieces of a most elaborate puzzle. Young Oliver stepped forward, the torn envelope clutched in his trembling fingers like a condemned man's reprieve. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, his voice cracking with the weight of terrible knowledge. "The safe contained more than financial records. There were letters, private correspondence, and someone copied not merely numbers, but signatures. Personal signatures that could destroy reputations, end careers, perhaps even hang someone for crimes they did not commit." "Précisément," Poirot nodded with satisfaction. "The forger's art, employed not for gain but for the creation of evidence. Our killer has been most thorough in their preparations." He turned to Hopkins with crisp authority. "Secure all entrances, the courtyard gate, the service door to Half Moon Street, the tradesman's entrance. No one departs, no parcel leaves, without your personal inspection." Miss Fairweather moved to comply with mechanical efficiency, but Poirot's voice stopped her with gentle firmness. "Mademoiselle, if you would be so kind as to summon Mrs. Ashford, Captain Thornfield, and Dr. Carstairs to the Peacock Lounge. The hour has come for truth to emerge from the shadows where it has hidden too long." As the group began to disperse, Poirot remained by the service stairs, his gaze fixed upon the polished boards where fresh wax gleamed treacherously in the gaslight. "Once before," he murmured to Hopkins, "these very steps claimed a life. Mr. Harrington, the banker, found at the bottom with his neck broken, the coroner's verdict of accident, accepted without question. The same hand employs the same method. The vanity of the murderer who admires their own technique too greatly to abandon it." The Peacock Lounge had transformed from an elegant gathering place into a chamber of judgment, its crystal chandeliers casting long shadows across the Persian carpets like the fingers of justice reaching toward truth. Dawn crept through the tall windows with reluctant persistence, illuminating faces drawn tight with fear and expectation. Poirot arranged the chairs in a precise semicircle, his fastidious attention to order serving both to calm his thoughts and unsettle his audience. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty, "we gather not merely to solve one murder, but to expose a web of deception that has claimed 3 lives across 6 months of meticulous planning." His green eyes swept the assembled company with penetrating intensity. "For you see, the death of Mr. Harrington was no accident, the murder of Sir Reginald no crime of passion, and the killing of Mr. Davies no desperate improvisation. Each was a calculated move in a game where the stakes were nothing less than life itself." "Missus." Ashford sat rigid in her chair, her fingers working nervously at her diamond necklace, each stone catching the morning light like captured tears. Captain Thornfield maintained his military bearing despite the weight of false accusation, while Dr. Carstairs leaned forward with the fascination of a man watching his profession's greatest mystery unfold. Young Oliver Pemberton clutched his notebook with white-knuckled desperation, and Miss Fairweather stood by the service door with professional composure that masked a heart racing with terrible knowledge. "The Bengal Mining Consortium," Poirot continued, his accent lending gravity to each syllable, "represented the perfect vehicle for embezzlement on a grand scale. Someone with access to private correspondence, hotel records, and the intimate financial secrets of London's elite discovered that trust could be weaponized as effectively as poison." He paused, allowing the implications to settle like morning fog. But Sir Reginald's investigation threatened exposure, and exposure meant not merely disgrace, but the gallows. He produced the steel device found in Davies's hand, turning it thoughtfully in the gaslight. This ingenious tool allowed our killer to manipulate the safety chain of room 9 from the corridor, creating the illusion of a locked room while standing safely outside. The same method claimed Mr. Harrington 6 months ago, his death so perfectly staged as an accident that no questions were asked. His gaze fixed upon Miss Fairweather with quiet satisfaction. But success bred confidence, and confidence bred carelessness. Poirot withdrew a fountain pen from his pocket, its silver surface gleaming with sinister purpose. The murder weapon, not a vial of poison or a blade, but an instrument of civilization turned to deadly purpose, filled with hydrocyanic acid instead of ink. It required only a moment's contact with the victim's skin to deliver death. He held up his own hand, revealing a faint circular burn on his thumb. The acid reacts with metal, leaving an inevitable mark even through gloves. Miss Fairweather's professional composure began to crack, her left foot shifting with the distinctive outward turn that had left its mark in the dust beside Davies's body. The killer required 3 elements for success, Poirot announced with methodical precision. Intimate knowledge of the hotel's layout, access to private financial records, and the ability to move through these corridors without suspicion day or night, at any hour, for any purpose. He turned to face Miss Fairweather directly, his voice gentle yet implacable. Mademoiselle Helena Fairweather, for 15 years you have managed this hotel's most sensitive arrangements, earning trust, through discretion and efficiency. But trust, once betrayed, becomes the deadliest weapon of all. The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Miss Fairweather's carefully constructed mask finally shattered, revealing the cold calculation that had orchestrated 3 murders with clockwork precision. "You understand nothing," she said, her voice carrying the bitter edge of desperation. £47,000. I embezzled from the Bengal mining accounts money meant for my sister's medical treatment, for my nephew's education, for a life that respectability demanded but my salary could never provide. Précisément, Poirot nodded with sad understanding. And when Mr. Harrington discovered the discrepancies during his audit, you staged his accident on the service stairs. Fresh wax, a push at the crucial moment, and the banker who threatened your secret died with his knowledge. His voice hardened. But Sir Reginald proved more thorough in his investigation. He found not merely the missing money, but evidence of your forgeries, your manipulation of investment documents, your systematic theft from the very people who trusted you most. Miss Fairweather's composure crumbled entirely. He would have destroyed everything, my position, my reputation, my family's future. My reputation. I sent him the warning note, hoping to frighten him into silence, but he was too honorable, too stubborn. Her voice rose with the hysteria of cornered desperation. I went to room 9 with the poisoned pen, telling him I had additional documents requiring his signature. He trusted me, took the pen without suspicion, and death claimed him before he could cry out. And then, Poirot continued remorselessly, you used your chain device to secure the room from outside, burned the most damaging evidence in the fireplace, and planted Captain Thornfield's cufflink to misdirect suspicion. But Mr. Davies discovered your method, found the tool you had hidden, and for that knowledge, he joined your growing list of victims. The confession complete. Miss Fairweather sagged against the doorframe like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Hopkins and the hotel security moved to apprehend her, their faces grim with the weight of betrayal. As they led her away, she turned back with eyes that held no remorse, only the bitter acknowledgement of defeat. Poirot adjusted his mustache with characteristic precision, his green eyes reflecting the wisdom of one who had seen too much of human nature's capacity for self-destruction. The human heart, he murmured to the remaining assembly. It is indeed a complicated machine, full of dark corners where desperation breeds monsters. But the little gray cells, they shine light into every shadow, and truth, however painful, must always triumph over deception. As the morning sun finally claimed the Peacock Lounge, banishing the shadows that had harbored such deadly secrets, Hercule Poirot gathered his things with the satisfaction of justice served and order restored to a world that had briefly forgotten the difference between right and wrong.